"You belong to me now," said the fierce virgin he found waiting in his inherited lodge. The Winchester rifle clicked as Cassandra McKenna chambered another round, her emerald eyes fixed on the dust cloud approaching through the Colorado Territory heat. 3 months she had been waiting in this godforsaken mountain lodge, and today felt different. Today, someone was finally coming. The leather holster around her waist held a Colt .45 that had belonged to her father, and she knew how to use it better than most men twice her age. At 20, she had already survived more than most people would in a lifetime, but nothing had prepared her for what was about to walk through that door. Magnus Thornfield pulled his stallion to a stop outside what should have been his property. The black horse snorted and pawed at the rocky ground, sensing something the man had not yet noticed. Sweat dripped from beneath his weathered hat as he studied the smoke rising from the chimney of the log structure his deceased uncle had left him. Someone was inside his lodge. The Colorado mountains stretched endlessly around them, their peaks still crowned with snow despite the summer heat that baked the lower elevations. Pine trees dotted the landscape like green sentinels, and somewhere in the distance a hawk circled lazily over the valley below. Magnus had ridden for 6 days straight from Denver to claim his inheritance, carrying nothing but a letter from a lawyer and the clothes on his back. At 30, he had seen enough of the world to know when something was not right, and everything about this situation felt wrong. He dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel path that led to the heavy wooden door. The lodge was bigger than he had imagined, built from massive logs that spoke of serious craftsmanship. Windows flanked the entrance, but heavy curtains blocked any view inside. The door opened before he could knock. Cassandra stood in the doorway, rifle raised and pointed directly at his chest. Her auburn hair was braided down her back, and despite the weapon in her hands, Magnus found himself struck by how beautiful she was. Fierce, dangerous, but undeniably beautiful. "State your business, stranger." Her voice carried the confidence of someone who had never backed down from a fight. Magnus raised his hand slowly, noting the way she held the rifle with practiced ease. This was no frightened girl playing with Daddy's gun. "Name's Magnus Thornfield. This lodge belongs to me now. My uncle Ezekiel left it to me when he passed." Cassandra's grip on the rifle never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just calculation. Ezekiel never mentioned having a nephew. Well, he had one. And I've got the papers to prove it. The standoff stretched between them, 2 stubborn wills meeting for the first time. The mountain wind whistled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of an afternoon thunderstorm. Magnus could see storm clouds gathering over the western peaks, their dark bellies pregnant with rain. Papers can be forged. So can a lot of things. Doesn't change the fact that I own this place now. Cassandra studied his face, looking for deception. She had become an expert at reading men's lies over the past 3 months, ever since she had arrived at the lodge with nowhere else to go. Ezekiel had taken her in when her own world had collapsed, and she had been caring for the old man when pneumonia finally claimed him 6 weeks ago. "You can put that rifle down. I'm not here to hurt you. That remains to be seen." But she lowered the weapon slightly, enough that it was no longer aimed at his heart. Magnus took this as progress and stepped closer to the doorway, close enough to smell the wood smoke that clung to her clothes and see the wariness that never quite left her eyes. "Mind if I come inside? It's my property, after all." The word stung, even though Cassandra had known this day would come. Ezekiel had warned her that he had family somewhere, distant relatives who might show up someday to claim what was theirs. She had just hoped it would be later rather than sooner. "Wipe your boots." She stepped aside to let him enter, but kept the rifle within easy reach. Magnus scraped his boots on the rough mat and walked into what felt like stepping back in time. The lodge was furnished with handmade furniture, thick rugs, and mounted animal heads that gazed down from the log walls. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and bookshelves lined another. Ezekiel always did have good taste. He was a good man. The way she said it made Magnus look at her more carefully. There was grief in those words, the kind that spoke of genuine loss rather than mere inconvenience. "You knew him well?" "He saved my life." She did not elaborate, and Magnus did not push. Everyone out here had stories they preferred to keep buried, and he was no exception. Instead, he walked to the window and pushed aside the heavy curtains to look out at the view. The lodge sat on a natural shelf of rock about halfway up the mountainside, offering a commanding view of the valley below and the peaks beyond. It was isolated, defensible, and absolutely breathtaking. No wonder Ezekiel had chosen this spot to build his retreat from the world. "How long have you been here?" 3 months. "And you've been alone all this time?" Cassandra bristled at the implication in his voice. "I can take care of myself just fine, thank you. I wasn't suggesting otherwise. Just seems like a lonely life for someone your age. Better lonely than dead." The words hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than she had intended to reveal. Magnus turned from the window to study her face again, noting the hard set of her jaw and the way her hand never strayed far from her weapon. "What are you running from?" "Who says I'm running from anything? Experience." Cassandra laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "What makes you think you have the right to ask me personal questions? You show up here claiming to own my home and think that gives you some kind of authority over me? Your home? This has been my home for 3 months. Ezekiel welcomed me here when I had nowhere else to go. I took care of him when he was sick, I buried him when he died, and I've been maintaining this place ever since. What claim do you have beyond a piece of paper?" Magnus pulled the legal documents from his coat pocket and set them on the wooden table that dominated the main room. "The claim of blood and law. Ezekiel was my father's brother, and this lodge passes to me as his heir." Cassandra glanced at the papers but did not move to examine them closely. She had no reason to doubt their authenticity, and even if she did, what could she do about it? The law was rarely kind to women in her position, especially women with secrets they needed to keep buried. So what happens now? "You throw me out into the wilderness to fend for myself?" "That depends." "On what?" "On who's trying to kill you." The question hit like a physical blow, and Cassandra actually took a step backward. Magnus watched her reaction with growing interest, noting the way her face had gone pale beneath her sun-bronzed skin. "I never said anyone was trying to kill me. You didn't have to. The way you hold that rifle, the way you answered the door, the way you keep watching the windows. You're not just hiding up here, you're fortified. Question is, who are you fortified against?" Cassandra sank into one of the wooden chairs, suddenly looking much younger than her 20 years. The weight of carrying her secrets alone for so long was beginning to show, and Magnus found himself feeling unexpectedly protective of this fierce stranger. "It doesn't matter. They'll never find me up here." "They?" She looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "Men who think they own things that can't be owned. Men who don't like being told no." Magnus sat down across from her at the table, his own expression growing serious. "What kind of men?" "The kind who wear badges and think that makes them untouchable." The admission hung between them like a loaded gun. In the Colorado Territory of 1878, corrupt lawmen were more common than honest ones, and crossing the wrong sheriff or marshal could mean a death sentence for anyone without powerful connections. "What did you do?" "I witnessed something I shouldn't have. Spoke up when I should have kept quiet."
"Refused to change my story when they asked me to."
Magnus leaned back in his chair, studying her face. Courage like that was rare, especially in someone so young. Most people would have taken whatever deal was offered and kept their mouths shut, but this girl had chosen to stand her ground even when it meant losing everything. Where did this happen? Pueblo, 3 months ago. The timeline matched her arrival at the lodge, which meant she had ridden hard and fast to reach this sanctuary in the mountains. Pueblo was a rough town, full of miners, gamblers, and men who settled disputes with bullets rather than words. "What exactly did you witness?" Cassandra was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the gathering storm clouds. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sheriff Blackwood and 2 of his deputies robbing the Wells Fargo office. They killed the clerk when he tried to fight back, then tried to make it look like a gang robbery. But I was there. I saw everything." Magnus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Sheriff Blackwood was notorious throughout the territory, a man who ruled Pueblo with an iron fist and had connections that reached all the way to Denver. Crossing him was tantamount to signing your own death warrant. "You testified against him?" "I tried to. Went to the federal marshal, told him what I'd seen. He promised to investigate, said he'd protect me while he gathered evidence. But Blackwood has friends everywhere." The marshal turned up dead 2 days later, shot in an alley behind the Silver Dollar Saloon. They made it look like a robbery, but his wallet was still full of money. Magnus whistled low under his breath. If Blackwood was willing to kill a federal marshal to protect his secret, he would certainly have no qualms about eliminating a young woman who could testify against him. "So you ran. Ezekiel found me on the trail 3 days out of Pueblo. My horse had gone lame and I was trying to walk through a snowstorm. He brought me here, told me I could stay as long as I needed to. And you've been hiding ever since." Not hiding, surviving. The distinction was important to her, Magnus realized. This was not a woman who cowered in the face of danger, but rather one who made strategic withdrawals when the odds were stacked against her. There was intelligence behind those green eyes, along with a steely determination that he found himself admiring despite the complications her presence created. Thunder rumbled across the valley, and the first fat raindrops began to splatter against the windows. The afternoon storm was moving in faster than expected, which meant traveling would soon become treacherous on the mountain trails. "What's your plan now?" Magnus asked. "You can't hide up here forever." "Why not? Ezekiel did it for 20 years. Ezekiel wasn't a 20-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her." "My whole life?" Cassandra laughed bitterly. "You mean the life where I'm constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering if today's the day Blackwood finally tracks me down? The life where I can never settle anywhere or trust anyone because the wrong word to the wrong person could get me killed. It doesn't have to be that way, doesn't it? Men like Blackwood don't just forget about loose ends. They tie them up permanently." Magnus stood and walked to the fireplace, stirring the coals with an iron poker. The lodge was starting to feel cold as the storm approached, and the fire would need fresh wood soon. Outside, the wind was picking up, causing the massive pines to sway and creak ominously. What if there was another way? Like what? Like making sure Blackwood can't hurt you anymore. Cassandra studied his profile in the firelight, trying to read his intentions. "And how exactly would you propose to do that? Are you some kind of gunfighter? A bounty hunter? What makes you think you could succeed where a federal marshal failed?" Magnus turned to face her, and for the first time since he had arrived, she saw something dangerous flicker in his dark eyes. "Let's just say I have some experience dealing with corrupt lawmen." "What kind of experience?" "The kind that usually ends with them in a pine box." The casual way he said it sent a shiver down Cassandra's spine, but not entirely from fear. There was something reassuring about the confidence in his voice, as if he had faced down dangerous men before and lived to tell about it. "You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice. Sometimes they're the same thing." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the mountains in stark relief against the darkening sky. The storm was almost upon them now, and Magnus knew they would be trapped in the lodge together until it passed. The thought was not entirely unpleasant. "I don't even know you," Cassandra said. "Why would you risk your life to help me? Maybe I don't like bullies who hide behind badges. Or maybe you want something in return." The accusation stung, but Magnus could not blame her for being suspicious. In her experience, men always wanted something, and they were rarely honest about what it was until it was too late. "What makes you think that?" "Experience. Men don't help women like me out of the goodness of their hearts." "Women like you?" "Women with nowhere to go and no one to protect them." Women who are desperate enough to trust strangers. Magnus walked back to the table and sat down across from her again, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes when he spoke. You're not desperate. Desperate women don't hold rifles like they know how to use them. Desperate women don't survive 3 months alone in the mountains. You're strong, Cassandra. Stronger than you give yourself credit for. The use of her name surprised her. She had not told him what it was, which meant Ezekiel must have mentioned her in some correspondence before his death. The thought that the old man had cared enough to write about her to his nephew brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Strength doesn't stop bullets. No, but intelligence does. And you're smart enough to know that running forever isn't really living. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we end this, permanently. The storm broke with sudden fury, sending sheets of rain against the windows and shaking the entire lodge with each clap of thunder. Cassandra jumped at a particularly loud crash, her hand instinctively going to her pistol before she realized it was just the weather. You're serious about this, aren't you? Dead serious. Why? What's in it for you? Magnus was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. Let's just say I have my own reasons for wanting to see Sheriff Blackwood brought to justice. What reasons? He killed someone I cared about 2 years ago in Denver. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Cassandra studied his face in the firelight, seeing grief and anger warring behind his carefully controlled expression. Who? My brother. The 2 words carried the weight of an entire tragedy, and Cassandra felt her heart clench with unexpected sympathy. She knew what it was like to lose someone to corruption and violence, to feel helpless in the face of institutional power. How? Thomas was a deputy marshal, one of the few honest lawmen left in the territory. He was investigating reports of corruption in Pueblo when he turned up dead in a brothel, supposedly killed by a jealous husband. But Thomas didn't frequent brothels, and the supposed husband disappeared the next day. You think Blackwood was behind it? I know he was. Thomas had sent me a letter 2 days before he died, saying he was close to exposing a network of corrupt officials that reached from Pueblo to Denver. He specifically mentioned Blackwood as the ringleader. Cassandra felt a chill of recognition. That's probably the same investigation that got the federal marshal killed after I tried to testify. More than likely. Which means Blackwood has killed at least 3 lawmen to protect his secret, not counting whoever else might have gotten in his way. The scope of the corruption was staggering, and Cassandra began to understand why Magnus was so determined to see justice done. This was not just about helping her anymore. It was about settling a blood debt that had been festering for 2 years. So what's your plan? Magnus stood and walked to a cabinet against the far wall, pulling out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured them each a measure of the amber liquid before returning to the table. First, we need to gather evidence. Real evidence that can't be dismissed or covered up. How do you propose to do that? Everyone who might have testified against him is already dead. Not everyone. There have to be other witnesses, other victims. Men like Blackwood don't operate in isolation. They have networks, patterns of behavior that leave traces. Cassandra sipped the whiskey, feeling it burn down her throat and settle warmly in her stomach. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the lodge felt secure and protected from the elements. Even if we could find evidence, who would we present it to? Every lawman in the territory seems to be either corrupt or dead. There are still a few honest men left. We just have to know where to look. And if we're wrong? If we trust the wrong person and end up dead like all the others? Magnus met her eyes across the table, and she saw something there that made her breath catch in her throat. It was not just determination or anger, but something deeper and more personal. Then at least we'll die fighting instead of hiding. The words hit her like a physical blow, mainly because they echoed thoughts she had been trying to suppress for weeks. Part of her was tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder, tired of living in constant fear. The idea of taking the fight to her enemies was both terrifying and strangely liberating. You're talking about starting a war. I'm talking about finishing one that Blackwood started when he decided innocent people were expendable. Lightning flashed again, and in its brief illumination, Cassandra saw her reflection in the dark window. She looked like a ghost of herself, pale and haunted by months of fear and isolation. Was this really how she wanted to spend the rest of her life? What makes you think we can succeed where trained lawmen have failed? Because we have something they didn't. What's that? Each other. The simple statement carried more weight than she had expected, and Cassandra found herself studying Magnus's face with new interest. There was strength there, competence, and something else that she was afraid to name. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're brave enough to stand up to corruption even when it costs you everything. I know you're smart enough to survive 3 months in hostile territory. And I know you're skilled enough with weapons to make any man think twice before crossing you. How do you know that last part? Magnus smiled for the first time since he had arrived, and the expression transformed his entire face. Because you're still alive, and men like Blackwood don't usually leave loose ends untied for this long. The compliment warmed her more than the whiskey had, and Cassandra felt some of her defensive walls beginning to crumble. It had been so long since anyone had seen her as capable rather than vulnerable, strong rather than weak. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing we become partners. You know Blackwood's methods, his associates, his territory. I know how to track down corruption and expose it in ways that can't be ignored or covered up. Together, we might actually have a chance. Partners in what, exactly? Justice. The word hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and danger in equal measure. Cassandra knew that accepting his proposal would mean giving up any chance of a quiet, safe life, but then again, she had already given that up the moment she decided to testify against a corrupt sheriff. And after? If we somehow managed to bring down Blackwood and his network, what then? Magnus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it held the answers to questions he had not yet learned to ask. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Well, maybe you should. Because if we're going to risk our lives together, I'd like to know what we're risking them for. The storm was beginning to pass, the thunder growing more distant and the rain settling into a steady rhythm against the roof. Soon the worst would be over, and they would both have to decide what came next. What do you want, Cassandra? If you could have anything, be anywhere, what would it be? The question caught her off guard, mainly because no one had asked her what she wanted in longer than she could remember. Everyone had always been more concerned with what she could provide for them. I want to stop being afraid. I want to wake up in the morning without immediately reaching for a weapon. I want to trust people again without wondering if they're going to betray me. That sounds like a good life. It sounds like an impossible life. Maybe. Or maybe it's the kind of life worth fighting for. Cassandra looked at him across the table. This stranger who had walked into her sanctuary and turned her world upside down in the space of a few hours. There was something about Magnus Thornfield that called to the part of her that had never learned to back down from a fight, the part that had gotten her into this mess in the first place. If we do this, if we actually try to take down Blackwood, there's no going back. He'll never stop hunting us. He's already hunting you. At least this way you get to hunt him back. The logic was undeniable, even if the prospect was terrifying. Cassandra had been playing defense for 3 months, reacting to threats and running from shadows. The idea of taking the offensive was both foreign and oddly appealing. I'll need guarantees. What kind of guarantees? If things go wrong, if we're captured or cornered, you don't try to save me at the cost of the mission. Blackwood's corruption has to be exposed, even if neither of us lives to see it. Magnus nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was asking. And if things go right, if we actually succeed, then maybe we can both stop running. The fire popped and crackled in the silence that followed, filling the lodge with warmth and light as the storm continued to rage outside. They were safe for now, protected by walls of solid timber and the isolation of the mountains, but both knew that safety was temporary. "There's something else you should know," Magnus said finally. "What?" "I'm not entirely sure I can be trusted with this." The admission was so unexpected that Cassandra nearly choked on her whiskey. "What do you mean?" "I mean that when I find the men who killed my brother, I might not be satisfied with just seeing them hang. There's a part of me that wants to make them suffer the way Thomas suffered." "And you think that makes you untrustworthy, doesn't it?" Cassandra studied his face in the firelight, seeing the conflict that raged beneath his controlled exterior. "It makes you human. If someone killed someone I loved, I'd want them to suffer too. But would you be able to stop yourself from acting on that want?" "I don't know. I guess we'll find out together." The honesty of her answer seemed to surprise them both, and they sat in silence for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to move on, the thunder growing fainter and the rain tapering off to a gentle patter. "So," Cassandra said finally, "when do we start?" "You're saying yes?" "I'm saying yes to partnership, yes to justice, and yes to finally fighting back instead of just running." Magnus raised his glass in a toast, and after a moment's hesitation, Cassandra clinked her glass against his. "To justice, to justice." They drank, and in that moment, their fates became inextricably intertwined. Neither could have predicted how dramatically their lives were about to change, or how high the cost of justice would ultimately prove to be. The storm passed, leaving the mountains washed clean and gleaming in the afternoon sunlight that broke through the dispersing clouds. But inside the lodge, Magnus and Cassandra were already planning for a different kind of storm, one that would shake the foundations of corruption throughout the Colorado Territory. They spent the remainder of the evening poring over maps and discussing strategy. Magnus had brought detailed territorial maps in his saddlebags, and Cassandra's knowledge of Pueblo's layout and Blackwood's habits proved invaluable as they began to formulate their approach. "The sheriff's office sits right on Main Street," Cassandra explained, tracing the street with her finger on the map. "But Blackwood rarely stays there during daylight hours. He prefers to conduct his real business at the Silver Dollar Saloon after dark." "What kind of real business?" "Meeting with his network. Other corrupt officials, gang leaders, anyone who pays him protection money. I watched him for weeks before I witnessed the robbery, trying to understand how his operation worked." Magnus looked up from the map with renewed respect. "You were investigating him?" "My father was a Pinkerton detective before he died. He taught me how to observe people, how to spot patterns and connections that others might miss. I thought if I could gather enough evidence, I might be able to expose him through proper channels." "What changed your mind?" "The night I saw him kill that clerk. There was something about the way he did it, so casual and methodical. I realized he wasn't just another corrupt sheriff skimming money from local businesses. He was something much worse." The firelight danced across her face as she spoke, highlighting the determination that had carried her through months of danger and uncertainty. Magnus found himself wondering what other secrets lay behind those green eyes. What other tragedies had shaped her into the formidable woman sitting across from him? "Tell me about his deputies." "Jake Morrison and Pete Kellerman. Morrison's the smarter of the two, but Kellerman's more vicious. They handle the collections, the intimidation, anything that requires violence or the threat of it. Both of them are wanted men using assumed names." "Wanted for what?" "Morrison robbed a bank in Kansas 2 years ago, killed a teller in the process. Kellerman was part of a gang that terrorized homesteaders in Wyoming, burning them out and stealing their land claims. Blackwood recruited them specifically because they had nowhere else to go. The scope of the corruption was even worse than Magnus had imagined. This was not just about a few crooked lawmen taking bribes. It was a criminal organization operating under the protection of legitimate authority. How many others are involved? At least a dozen that I know of. Mayor Hutchins takes a cut of everything in exchange for looking the other way. Judge Patterson ensures that anyone who causes problems, either gets convicted on trumped-up charges or has their cases dismissed if they're useful to the organization. Doc Brennan falsifies death certificates to cover up murders. What about the honest citizens? Surely someone else has noticed what's happening. Cassandra laughed bitterly. The ones who notice tend to end up dead or driven out of town. The rest are too scared to speak up, and can you blame them? Blackwood controls the law, the courts, and the local government. Who are they supposed to turn to? Us. The simple declaration carried more weight than 2 syllables should have been able to bear. Cassandra looked at Magnus in the firelight, seeing something in his expression that made her breath catch in her throat. You really believe we can do this? I believe we have to try. Too many good people have died already. And if we fail, if we end up joining them, then at least we'll have died fighting for something that mattered. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze. Hoofbeats on the mountain trail, approaching fast despite the treacherous conditions left by the storm. Magnus was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the Colt on his hip. How many people know about this place? No one, as far as I know. Ezekiel was very careful about keeping it secret, but even as she spoke, Cassandra was moving toward the window, peering through the curtains at the trail below. 3 riders were approaching the lodge, their horses picking their way carefully over the rain-slicked rocks. Do you recognize them? It's too dark to tell, but they're riding like they know exactly where they're going. Magnus blew out the oil lamps, plunging the lodge into darkness except for the glow from the fireplace. Can we get out the back way? There's a rear door that leads to a trail up to the ridgeline, but in the dark and with the rocks still wet from the rain, it would be suicide to try to navigate it. Then we make our stand here. Cassandra checked her rifle and pistol, ensuring both were fully loaded. If these are Blackwood's men, they won't take us alive. Good. I wasn't planning on being taken. The hoofbeats grew louder, then stopped just outside the lodge. Magnus positioned himself beside the front window while Cassandra took cover behind an overturned table near the back door. They waited in tense silence, listening to the sound of boots on gravel. A voice called out from the darkness, gravelly and rough around the edges. "We know you're in there, girl. Sheriff Blackwood sends his regards." Cassandra's blood ran cold. Somehow, impossibly, they had found her. After 3 months of perfect concealment, her sanctuary had been compromised. "He's got a proposition for you," the voice continued. "Come out peaceful-like, and maybe we can work something out. Stay inside, and things get unpleasant real quick." Magnus caught Cassandra's eye across the darkened room and shook his head slightly. There would be no negotiations, no deals. Men like these understood only violence, and they had come prepared to use it. "What do you say, Missy? You ready to be reasonable?" Cassandra's answer came in the form of a rifle shot that shattered the front window and sent the speaker diving for cover behind his horse. The animal reared and whinnied in terror, and suddenly the night erupted in gunfire. Bullets splintered the wooden walls and shattered glass as Magnus and Cassandra returned fire. The attackers had positioned themselves well, using their horses and the natural cover of rocks and trees to protect themselves while they tried to force their way into the lodge. "There's supposed to be just one girl in there." Someone shouted over the gunfire. "Who the hell is shooting at us? Does it matter? Blackwood wants her dead either way." Magnus smiled grimly as he reloaded his pistol. At least now they knew for certain who had sent these men. The only question was how they had found the lodge after all this time. The back door. Cassandra called out as she spotted movement in the shadows. "They're trying to flank us." Magnus spun and fired twice at the figure creeping around the side of the building. His shots were rewarded with a cry of pain and the sound of someone falling heavily to the ground. "That's one down." But even as he spoke, more gunfire erupted from the front of the lodge. These men were professionals, coordinating their attack to keep their targets pinned down while they maneuvered for better positions. A bullet whined past Magnus's ear, close enough that he could feel the heat of its passage. He dove behind the heavy wooden table that served as Cassandra's dining surface cursing as splinters exploded around him. "We can't keep this up forever," Cassandra shouted over the din. "They have us outnumbered and we're running low on ammunition. How much do you have left?" 6 rounds for the rifle, maybe 8 for the pistol. Magnus quickly counted his own remaining bullets. The situation was dire, but not yet hopeless. These men were good, but they were also overconfident. They had expected to find a single frightened woman, not a prepared defensive position. "Can you get to the fireplace?" "Maybe." "Why?" Ezekiel kept black powder for blasting stumps. "If we can create a diversion." His words were cut off as the front door exploded inward under the impact of a rifle butt. One of the attackers rushed through the opening, firing wildly into the darkness. Cassandra's rifle cracked once, and the man pitched backward with a scream that cut off abruptly. 2 down. But the breach had been made, and more men were already moving to exploit it. Magnus could hear them outside, regrouping for a final assault. In moments, they would rush the lodge from multiple directions simultaneously. "Cassandra." "What?" "When I give the word, run for the back door and don't look back." "I'm not leaving you." "You have to. Someone needs to survive to tell the world what Blackwood has done." Before she could argue further, Magnus rose from cover and charged toward the front door, firing both pistols simultaneously. His sudden offensive caught the attackers by surprise, forcing them back and creating the opening Cassandra needed. "Now, go!" But instead of running, Cassandra grabbed the black powder from beside the fireplace and hurled the entire keg toward the front of the lodge. Her rifle shot that followed created an explosion that lit up the night sky and sent debris flying in all directions. The blast knocked both Magnus and the surviving attackers to the ground, temporarily stunning everyone involved. When Magnus's ears stopped ringing and his vision cleared, he found Cassandra kneeling beside him, her face streaked with soot but her eyes bright with fierce satisfaction. "I told you I wasn't leaving. You could have been killed. So could you. That's what partners do, isn't it? Watch each other's backs?" Magnus struggled to his feet, checking for injuries and finding nothing more serious than cuts from flying splinters. The explosion had devastated the front of the lodge, but the massive log construction had held together. "Are they all dead?" Cassandra peered out through the smoking wreckage that had once been the front door. "I can see 2 bodies, but there were 3 of them originally." As if summoned by her words, a figure emerged from the shadows near the tree line. The surviving attacker was badly wounded, leaning heavily against a pine tree as he tried to reload his pistol with shaking hands. "You've got nowhere to run now," he called out, his voice weak but still defiant. "Blackwood knows where you are. He'll send more men, as many as it takes." Magnus walked calmly toward the wounded man, his Colt steady in his hand. "How did you find us?" "Go to hell, you first." The gunshot echoed across the mountain valley, sending night birds erupting from their roosts in panicked flight. When the echoes finally died away, silence returned to the lodge and the surrounding wilderness. Cassandra joined Magnus beside the body, studying the dead man's face in the pale moonlight that had emerged from behind the storm clouds. "Do you recognize him?" "Pete Kellerman, one of Blackwood's deputies." "Which means the sheriff knows exactly where we are." "It also means he's scared enough of what we might do to risk sending his most trusted men after us." Magnus holstered his weapon and looked around at the destruction surrounding the lodge. The building was still structurally sound, but the front wall would need extensive repairs before it would be truly defensible again. "We can't stay here." "No. They'll be back, probably with more men and better planning. Where can we go?" Cassandra was quiet for a moment, thinking through their limited options. "There's an old mining camp about 20 miles north of here. It was abandoned when the silver played out, but the buildings are still intact. Can we reach it before dawn? If we push hard and the trail conditions aren't too bad." Magnus nodded and headed toward the stable behind the lodge where his horse was waiting. "Gather whatever supplies we can carry. Food, ammunition, anything that might be useful." As they prepared to abandon the sanctuary that had sheltered Cassandra for 3 months, both knew they were crossing a line from which there could be no return. They were no longer hiding from their enemies. They were actively hunting them. The war between justice and corruption was about to begin in earnest, and the mountains of Colorado would bear witness to a conflict that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of law and order throughout the territory. The real adventure was just beginning. The abandoned mining camp of Silver Creek sat like a ghost town against the stark Colorado landscape, its weathered buildings testament to dreams that had died when the ore veins ran dry. Magnus and Cassandra had ridden through the night to reach this desolate sanctuary, their horses picking their way carefully along treacherous mountain trails by moonlight. Dawn was breaking over the eastern peaks as they finally dismounted in what had once been the town's main street. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through broken windows and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "This place gives me the shivers," Cassandra muttered, checking the loads in her weapons out of habit. "It's perfect for what we need. Isolated, defensible, and completely abandoned." They chose the old assayer's office as their base of operations, mainly because it still had an intact roof and walls thick enough to stop bullets. While Magnus tended to their horses in what remained of the stable, Cassandra explored the building and found it surprisingly well preserved despite years of neglect. "There's even a safe," she called out as Magnus returned with their supplies. "Whoever owned this place was serious about security. Can you open it? My father taught me a few tricks about locks and safes. Give me some time." While Cassandra worked on the safe, Magnus climbed to the building's second floor to survey their surroundings. The mining camp occupied a natural bowl in the mountains, surrounded on 3 sides by steep cliffs and accessible only through the narrow canyon they had used to enter. It was an excellent defensive position, but it would also become a trap if they were discovered. From his vantage point, he could see the entire camp spread out below. Most of the buildings were in various states of decay, but several looked sturdy enough to provide additional cover if needed. The old mine entrance gaped like a black mouth on the far side of the settlement, its wooden supports still standing despite the passage of time. "Got it." Cassandra's triumphant call brought him back downstairs, where he found her kneeling beside the open safe. Inside were several ledgers, a small bag of silver coins, and what appeared to be official correspondence. Anything useful? Maybe. These ledgers show payments made to various territorial officials over the past few years. And look at this. She handed him a letter bearing an official seal. Magnus read it quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. This is correspondence between the mine owner and someone in the territorial governor's office. They're discussing protection payments and favorable mining claims. The corruption goes higher than we thought. Much higher. This suggests that Blackwood's network includes people in Denver, possibly even in the territorial capital. Cassandra sank into a dusty chair, suddenly looking exhausted. The night ride had taken its toll, and the implications of what they had discovered were overwhelming. "How do we fight something this big, Magnus?" "We're talking about corruption that reaches the highest levels of territorial government. The same way you eat an entire buffalo, one bite at a time." Despite everything, his answer made her smile. "That's a terrible analogy, but it's accurate. We start with Blackwood and work our way up the chain. Cut off the head, and the body dies. And if the body has more than one head, then we cut off as many as we can find." Magnus pulled out the territorial maps they had studied the night before, spreading them across a makeshift table constructed from wooden crates. "Tell me about Blackwood's routine. When does he meet with his network? Where does he keep his records?" "He holds court at the Silver Dollar every Friday night. All the major players show up to report their weekly take and receive their orders for the following week. That's today. Which means he'll be distracted, focused on business rather than hunting us. Or it means he'll have extra security because he knows we're out here somewhere." Cassandra studied the map, tracing possible routes into Pueblo with her finger. There's a back way into town through the old cattle trails. It would put us within a quarter-mile of the Silver Dollar without having to use the main roads. How well do you know the layout of the saloon itself? Well enough. I spent weeks watching the place, learning the patterns of everyone who went in and out. Guards? Usually 2 posted outside, 1 at the bar, and at least 1 more roaming the main floor. But on Friday nights, they get careless. Too much whiskey and too much confidence. Magnus was quiet for several minutes, studying the map and considering their options. What they were contemplating was essentially a military operation against a fortified position defended by professional killers. We'll need a diversion. Something big enough to draw attention away from our real objective. What's our real objective? Are we trying to capture Blackwood alive or just gather evidence of his corruption? Both, if possible. Dead men can't confess to their crimes or implicate their co-conspirators. But living men can lie, especially when they have powerful friends to protect them. The philosophical debate was interrupted by the sound of distant gunfire echoing across the mountain valleys. Both Magnus and Cassandra froze, listening intently as the shots continued in sporadic bursts. That's coming from the direction of the lodge. Blackwood must have sent more men to search the ruins, which means they still don't know where we've gone, yet. Magnus climbed back up to the 2nd floor to get a better view of the surrounding terrain. Through his field glasses, he could see smoke rising from the direction of Ezekiel's lodge, confirming their suspicions. They're burning what's left of the place, making sure we can never go back. We weren't going back anyway. But despite his confident words, Magnus felt a pang of loss for the sanctuary that had briefly felt like home. Ezekiel's lodge had represented peace and safety, qualities that seemed increasingly rare in their violent world. When he returned downstairs, he found Cassandra cleaning her rifle with methodical precision. Her movements were economical and practiced, speaking of countless hours spent maintaining her weapons. You're thinking about tonight. I'm thinking about survival. If we're going to take this risk, we need to be prepared for every possible outcome, including the possibility that we don't make it out alive. Especially that possibility. Magnus sat down across from her, watching as she worked. There was something almost meditative about the way she handled the rifle, as if the familiar routine helped calm her nerves and focus her thoughts. Tell me about your father. The question seemed to surprise her, and she paused in her cleaning to look up at him. What about him? You said he was a Pinkerton detective. What was he like? A sad smile crossed her face as she resumed working on the rifle. He was the most honest man I ever knew. Sometimes I think that's what killed him. How so? He refused to compromise his principles, even when it would have been safer to look the other way. He made enemies of powerful men who preferred their secrets to stay buried. Sounds like you inherited more than just his investigative skills. Maybe, or maybe I'm just too stubborn to know when I'm beaten. There's a difference between stubborn and determined. Is there? Sometimes I'm not so sure. They worked in companionable silence for the next several hours, cleaning weapons, checking supplies, and finalizing their plans for the evening assault on the Silver Dollar. As the afternoon wore on, both felt the tension building like pressure in a thundercloud. Magnus? Yes? If something happens tonight, if one of us doesn't make it back, nothing's going to happen. But if it does, she persisted, I want you to know that I'm grateful. For everything you've done, for giving me a chance to fight back instead of just running. You don't need to thank me for that. You would have done the same thing eventually, with or without my help. Would I? I'm not so sure. It's easier to run when you're alone. Having a partner changes things. Magnus looked at her across the dusty room, noting how the afternoon light streaming through the broken windows highlighted the determined set of her jaw and the intelligence in her green eyes. It changes everything. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. They were partners in a dangerous enterprise, allies in a war against corruption, but something else was developing beneath the surface of their professional relationship. "We should get some rest before tonight. It's going to be a long evening." "Good idea." But neither of them moved from their positions, and the silence stretched between them with an almost electric tension. Finally, Magnus stood and walked to the window, ostensibly to check their perimeter, but mainly to put some distance between himself and the increasingly complicated feelings that Cassandra inspired in him. "Magnus?" "Yes?" "What happens after?" "If we succeed, if we actually manage to bring down Blackwood and his network, what do you do then?" It was the same question she had asked the night before, and he still did not have a good answer for it. For 2 years his entire existence had been focused on avenging his brother's death. He had never seriously considered what his life might look like beyond that goal. "I don't know. I suppose I'll have to figure that out when the time comes. You could stay in Colorado. There will always be a need for honest men willing to stand up to corruption." "Is that an invitation?" The question slipped out before he could stop it, and he immediately regretted the presumption. They barely knew each other, despite the intensity of their shared circumstances. "Maybe," she said quietly. "Would you be interested in that kind of life?" "I might be, depending on the company." This time the silence that fell between them was different, charged with possibilities that neither had dared to voice before. They were balanced on the edge of something that went far beyond their temporary partnership, something that could change both their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. The spell was broken by the sound of horses approaching through the canyon. Magnus immediately moved to the window while Cassandra grabbed her rifle, both falling back into their familiar defensive positions. "How many?" "2 riders, moving slow and easy. They don't seem to be in any hurry. Could be scouts for a larger force. Or they could be travelers who happened to stumble across this place." Through his field glasses, Magnus could make out more details of the approaching riders. Both were older men, one wearing the distinctive uniform of a territorial marshal, the other dressed in the plain clothes of a civilian. One of them's a lawman. Friend or foe? That remains to be seen. The riders pulled up in the main street of the abandoned town, looking around at the decaying buildings with obvious interest. The marshal dismounted and walked slowly toward the assayer's office, his hand resting casually on his pistol. "Hello in there. We're not looking for trouble, just hoping to have a conversation." Magnus and Cassandra exchanged glances. The voice sounded genuine, but they had learned to be suspicious of everyone, especially lawmen. "What kind of conversation?" Magnus called back. "The kind that might be mutually beneficial. My name is Marshal William Garrett, and I've been investigating reports of corruption in this territory." The name meant nothing to Magnus, but he saw recognition flicker in Cassandra's eyes. "You know him?" "I know of him. He was the one who was supposed to replace the federal marshal that Blackwood had killed. If he's really who he says he is, he might be one of the few honest lawmen left in the territory. And if he's not, then we're about to walk into a very elaborate trap." Magnus made a decision that went against every survival instinct he possessed. "We're coming out, but we're keeping our weapons, and any sudden moves will be met with immediate force." "Understood. We'll keep our hands visible." Slowly, carefully, Magnus and Cassandra emerged from the assayer's office. The marshal was exactly as he had appeared through the field glasses, a weathered man in his 50s with gray hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. His companion was younger but carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. "You must be the young woman who tried to testify against Sheriff Blackwood. What makes you think that?" "Because you're still alive, which means you're either very lucky or very good with those weapons you're carrying." Marshal Garrett's manner was calm and professional, inspiring a confidence that neither Magnus nor Cassandra had felt in the presence of a lawman for months. "Who's your friend?" Magnus asked, nodding toward the civilian. "Federal Judge Harrison from Denver. He's here to authorize arrests and ensure that any evidence we gather will be admissible in territorial court." The judge stepped forward. A man in his 40s with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Marshal Garrett has briefed me on the situation. We're prepared to offer you both full amnesty in exchange for your cooperation in bringing Sheriff Blackwood to justice. What kind of cooperation? Cassandra asked suspiciously. Testimony, evidence, whatever you can provide to help us build a case that will stand up in court. And in the meantime, we're supposed to trust that you can keep us alive long enough to testify? We have resources that Blackwood doesn't know about. Safe houses, federal marshals who haven't been compromised, connections that reach all the way to Washington. Magnus studied both men carefully, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. How did you find us here? We've been tracking Blackwood's men since they attacked Ezekiel's lodge last night. When they rode back to Pueblo empty-handed, we figured you had escaped and would need somewhere to regroup, so you followed us. We followed the logical possibilities. There aren't many places in these mountains where someone could hide for any length of time. Judge Harrison stepped forward again, his expression serious. I won't lie to you. What we're proposing is dangerous. Blackwood has connections throughout the territorial government, and some of those connections reach into federal circles as well. Then why should we trust you? Because we're the only chance you have of ending this war without getting yourselves killed. The brutal honesty of the statement hit home with both Magnus and Cassandra. They had been planning a frontal assault against overwhelming odds, hoping that surprise and determination would be enough to see them through. What exactly are you proposing? Magnus asked. We used tonight's meeting at the Silver Dollar to gather evidence and make arrests. You provide inside information about the participants and their activities. We provide the manpower and legal authority to shut them down permanently. And afterward? Afterward, you testify at their trials and then disappear into new lives with new identities, courtesy of the federal government.